Have you ever looked at a piece of art or read a poem and thought, wow, this is just a lot? A little chaotic, maybe. Well, imagine an entire movement of artists and writers who felt that way. That's the story of Neoclassicism. We're going to dive into this really powerful shift that happened back in the 17th and 18th centuries, a time when people wanted to rebuild the entire world of art based on order, reason, and the big ideas from ancient Greece and Rome. So let's get right into it.
So, the first thing you have to understand is that Neoclassicism didn't just pop up out of nowhere. No, it was a rebellion, a direct reaction to what came right before it. You had the Renaissance and the Baroque periods, which were all about wild fantasy, crazy amounts of decoration, and, celebrating the individual artist's imagination. Well, the Neoclassicists looked at all that and pretty much said, all right, that's enough. They wanted to trade all that chaos for pure, simple reason, order, and truths that applied to everyone.
And this wasn't just, a minor tweak in style. This was a full-on rejection of what they saw as total artistic chaos. They felt that art had just become way too self-indulgent. It was filled with what they called the superfluous and the fantastic, basically a lot of extra stuff that didn't serve any real logical purpose.
And they were super specific about what they didn't like. For starters, all that over-the-top ornamentation in Baroque art, gone. In literature, they took issue with writers like Spencer and Milton, for creating these made-up worlds full of mythical creatures. They really hated the idea that a poet could just invent a world that was somehow superior to nature. For them, an artist's job wasn't to create a new, better reality. No, it was to perfectly represent the one we already have.
Okay, so if art isn't this explosion of individual genius and wild inspiration, then what is it? Well, for them, the answer was actually pretty simple. Art is a craft. It's a rational process, something that has rules you can actually study, learn, and perfect, just like building a chair or designing a building.
This quote just nails it. It gets right to the heart of how they thought about things. See, for them, creating a poem or a play wasn't some mystical act. It was more like being an architect. You need a blueprint, you need skill, and you gotta put in the work. It was a huge vote for disciplined craftsmanship over raw, untamed inspiration.
And believe me, this obsession with order, it went into everything. They didn't just have rules for how you should write, they had rules for what was even worth writing about. They came up with this really strict hierarchy of genres. And right there at the very top, the epic. Think Homer's Odyssey. And why was it number one? Because it dealt with these huge, universal themes and had a clear moral purpose. In their world, everything had its proper place on the shelf.
Now, this entire way of thinking was built on two core concepts, nature and imitation. And I promise, if you can get your head around what they meant by these two words, you'll understand the whole neoclassical mindset. It all comes down to this.
First things first, we have to be crystal clear on this. When a neoclassical thinker said nature, they were not talking about trees and mountains and flowers, not at all. For them, nature was like the universe's source code, the deep, underlying rational order for everything. It was the permanent, universal truth about what it means to be human, the moral fabric of the world. It was this huge, grand system where everything and everyone had a purpose and a place.
So, if your goal is to represent this perfect, orderly nature, how in the world do you actually do that? The answer, for them, was imitation. And this word had a really clever two-part meaning. On one hand, it meant imitating human action in a realistic way. But, and this is the genius part, it also meant imitating the great classical masters. Homer, Virgil, Horace. Why? Because the neoclassicists believed those guys had already perfected the art of imitating nature. And this is the masterstroke right here. This idea, which the poet Alexander Pope summed up so perfectly, just fuses those two concepts together. I mean, why reinvent the wheel, right? If the ancients already figured out how to perfectly reflect universal nature, then the most logical, the most rational thing an artist could do was to study and imitate them. It was like a perfect shortcut to perfection.
But hey, don't think this was some perfectly unified movement where everyone held hands and agreed. I mean, for a group of people so obsessed with logic, they sure did love a good argument. And their biggest one was this huge debate between the so-called ancients and the moderns. It all basically boiled down to one big question. Just how strictly should we follow all those old rules?
So on one side, you had the ancients. These were the traditionalists. They believed that the classical models were the ultimate source of wisdom, good sense, and order. But on the other side, the moderns were pushing back. They argued for a little more flexibility, they valued originality, and they believed that new times and new ways of thinking required new kinds of art, maybe even mixing genres, which was a huge no-no for the ancients. This was the central tension of the entire era. All right, let's pull back for a second and look at the big picture. What was the end game here? What was the ultimate goal of all this? Well, it was to create art that reflected their brand new understanding of the universe itself, a universe they were just starting to see not as some big mystery, but as a perfect, well-oiled machine.
And this is where it all just clicks together beautifully. You have to remember what was happening in science at this exact time. You've got people like Isaac Newton discovering these fixed, physical laws that govern the planets, gravity, everything. The Neoclassicists saw that, and it was like a massive light bulb went off. They thought, that's it. They became convinced that human nature, society, and art itself must operate on similar, predictable, rational laws. In their eyes, a perfect poem should be just as logical, just as balanced, as a planet's orbit around the sun.
So, if you're going to boil it all down, Neoclassicism was this huge, ambitious project to make art rational. It was all built on a few core beliefs: that art needs to have a moral point, that it absolutely has to follow rules based on nature and the classics, that its highest values are balance and harmony, and that its ultimate goal is to say something true and timeless for all of humanity.
And that leaves us with a question that's just as real and relevant today as it was 300 years ago. Just think about the music, the movies, the art that you love. Does greatness need a foundation of rules to build on, or is real, true creativity only found where we decide to tear those rules down? Something to